My name is Matt Prewitt. I'm president of RadicalxChange Foundation.
And I'm Victoria. I am the R&D strategic lead at Serpentine Arts Technologies. We're super excited and also a little bit nervous in a good way to gather such an exceptional group of people and together explore how art and culture can help reshape the imaginaries, mechanisms, and practices of ownership. So to start out, the obligatory but incredibly important round of thanks. A massive thank you to Somerset House Studios. I'm trying to see where you are, Marie, Laurent, and Louise, for so generously providing the physical infrastructure for this day, and also for the patience in supporting us in pulling this event together. Somerset House Studios is such a precious epicenter of dynamic cultural activity in London, and we couldn't imagine a better place than here for this gathering. Now, thank you to Dark Matter Labs, and this is a bit more of an abstract thank you, but a really important one, for a vision around systems change that integrates complexity and optimism, not an easy task to do in these days. A nuanced systems view that opens up new ways for understanding how we can exercise our agency to imagine and configure new realities. Now, the wider Beyond Cultures of Ownership project, which goes beyond this day, probably as the title suggests, and of course this event could not have been possible without the incredible dedication and ingenuity of our dear team members. So please, a big round of applause for Angela, Ava, Alex, Ruth, Jack, Jaime, Kay, Lena, Paula, Tamar, Rolf, Lucia, and Severin. Thank you so much, guys. And thank you to our speakers, Indy, Hillary, Danielle, Divya, Sam, Adrienne, and actually we'll have somebody stepping in for Adrienne today, so thank you, Matt and Holly, for joining us today to share your experiences and insights, and for taking the time to chart the coordinates that can help us orient and navigate today's discussions. So as most of you know, today is going to be spent in an open space format, meaning that the focus is really on all of us together to steer the ship. But we're incredibly lucky to have Improbable facilitate this experience for us. So thank you to Varshini, who's not here, but to Nick and Andrew over there for helping us guide in this, helping us guide in the preparatory phases, and also for holding the space for what is meant to hopefully unfold organically today. And of course, thank you to all of you for the motivation, the good faith, and the commitment to be here for the whole day. We hope that this is going to be a rewarding experience on different level and timescales.
All right, so the name of this event is Beyond Cultures of Ownership, Emerging Strategies for Interdependence. What's behind this title? The first part of it sort of focuses on ownership, and the imaginary of ownership is basically sort of one of separation and atomization and independence, or kind of a striving towards autonomy. And I think that many of us have a sense that we want to kind of look for ways of getting beyond that way of organizing power. And so the other part of the title focuses on interdependence, and which is really the other just the other side of the coin of ownership, and what does it look like concretely to develop systems and institutions that get beyond that imaginary of private ownership and embrace the reality of interdependence. That's really what we hope to explore together today. So as Victoria mentioned, this is part of a larger project, a wider project, including Dark Matter Labs, Margaret Levy and her team at Stanford, and many other partners, all of whom are really interested in deeply studying ownership and its details, and not just sort of critiquing it, but also experimentally reconfiguring and culturally reimagining our institutions. So changes to foundational institutions, I think one thing to notice first of all is that many of the most important changes in history have come in the form of changes to the institution of ownership, for both better and worse. And when you think about where these changes come from, they come from different sectors of society. They often come from technology, they sometimes come from policy, they sometimes come from the academy. But our sense is that right now, a question about the future of ownership has opened up, and that the cultural and artistic space is really powerfully positioned to influence how it develops. So what we want to do today is to ask you to focus on this issue, to be fully present, to look for opportunities to connect with the many other brilliant people in this room, and hopefully to form exciting collaborations around the issue. So the broader collaboration that that has helped put together this this event is going to continue to be working on this. There will be another gathering on the theme of ownership in Oakland, California, on March 1st and 2nd. We hope some of you might be able to be present at. And in any case, we just want you to be involved. We want to continue. We want to find ways to find new collaborators and get as many brilliant creators and thinkers working together on this problem as we can. So I think for Victoria and I, this question of ownership is not merely like a professional or intellectual thing. So we want to tell you a little bit about where we're coming from. So, I mean, like many other people on the face of this earth, I in my at an early time in my life, kind of financial issues had an important impact on me and my family. This is nothing unique, but it was sort of emotionally activating. And since then, I've become sort of a student of the way that money intervenes in people's lives. It can render us extremely powerful. It can render us totally helpless. And many people in some ways seem sort of condemned to totally organize their lives around it. Yet in many ways, I think that money seems sort of unworthy of the power that it wields over us. It often seems to favor the unscrupulous more than the virtuous. An important event for me was in 2008. I saw that the people who caused the financial collapse were the ones who were suffering its consequences the least. And I ended up becoming a lawyer because I really wanted to just deeply understand how our institutions could be so upside down. As a lawyer, I made my way to antitrust litigation. Antitrust is, in my view, kind of like the great idea in modern legal history, because it responds to one of the central problems of modernity, which is the problem of the concentration of power. And what I mean by that is just the simple fact that it takes money to make money, and that power begets power. But antitrust law is a sort of an intervention that tries to say, no, it doesn't have to work exactly that way. We can build laws and institutions that break that pattern and instead sort of reach towards a higher purpose. But antitrust and many of the other legal tools that helped modern societies respond to the challenges of the industrial era are for many reasons sort of failing to meet our challenges today. So through RadicalxChange, I found kind of a different way into these problems. I met a bunch of other people who are willing to look directly at the heart of the issue of money and ownership and inequality through sort of a different lens, in particular the lens of mechanism design and institutional design, which gave me sort of different ways of thinking about the question of why money is so hard to transcend. And to cut straight to the chase, my answer to that question is because money buys ownership and the sort of awesome powers of ownership. But these powers are not defined from on high. They can be reimagined, and they can be reimagined in more than just the usual ways of sort of dividing them into more pieces or consolidating them into a state that is meant to represent more people. We can also alter their duration in time. We can alter the scope and space of ownership interests. And by thinking deeply about them, we can change the nature of our interwovenness with other people and communities and ecosystems. So basically, ownership is an institution that tries to map our entire relationship with the world. And because the world is constantly changing, this means that ownership must be periodically reimagined. So the medieval notions of ownership mixed unhappily with the early modern era. The early modern institutions of ownership mixed unhappily with the industrial age. the industrial age notions of ownership mixed unhappily with our present era, and I think we could even go closer in time and say that some of the ideas about sort of open culture and some of the ideas about ownership from the early internet era are not serving us as well as we might like today. So it's up to us to bring this centuries-long conversation up to the moment, I think, to surmount this problem as best we can before the outdatedness of our institutions of ownership does more damage politically, socially, and environmentally than they already have.
So similarly to Matt, I was drawn to a very specific branch of law, international human rights law. Could call it one of the great ideas in contemporary legal history, which also today has lost all of its operational efficacy and, somewhat ironically or not, is actually being weaponized against the very things that it was meant to address. But I have a slightly different personal history. So I was born and spent the first 9 years of my life in a place called Donetsk, East Ukraine. Now many of you might know of it because it's a disputed territory with the unofficial title of Donetsk People's Republic. And yeah, growing up, so I was born in '86, so I grew up in a relatively severe societal context of the '90s amidst the kind of violence that accompanied the privatization of the coal mining and metallurgical industries. And sort of growing up in the middle of that made me idealize kind of outside global systems of power that could be used as leverage, so international human rights, to resist and counteract local abuses of power and oppression. So in my early 20s, I actively participated in the human rights movement, both in Ukraine and internationally. It was also a period when I sort of started piecing together the various horrors that my great-parents' and great-grandparents' generations experienced, and which sort of dovetail with the general experiences of Soviet industrialization of the 1930s, particularly in a place like Donetsk, the industrial heartland of Soviet Union, and also the place that's largely kind of responsible for the glamorization of forced stripping of pre-Soviet cultural identities and practices. But in the process, kind of what became evident to me is that there were so many kind of layers of unprocessed trauma across generations, and that their contemporary and savory consequences were being supercharged by the wild hedonism of the market economy, and that the legalistic lens of human rights just wasn't really equipped to address this at its complex roots. So around 2010, through various serendipitous events, I ended up co-running a new arts organization in Donetsk. And the mission of that arts organization was to reflect on the repressed histories of that area and its role in Soviet Union, as well as to critically engage with its present through artistic and cultural lens. But then, in 2014, after a number of hard lessons trying to get this art center off the ground, and some minor breakthroughs, our space, so that's the territory of our space, was seized from us at gunpoint by a Russian militia. Well, technically they were Chechen, but they were pro-Russian militia. So the art center was turned into a secret prison and a torture facility. I still struggle to fully make sense as to what exactly happened there, beyond the very obvious explanation of this weird art project disappearing in the cracks of geopolitical warfare. But I also don't think it's a coincidence that this specific site was chosen as one of the targets for expulsion in one of the first sites for expulsion in Russia's capture of the city, and the symbolism of turning a weird art space into a prison and torture facility. At the same time, the relatively extreme nature of that experience made me question how best to think strategically about the emergence of new narratives and knowledge. That is, that's usually what happens in, let's say, good cultural context and good kind of contemporary cultural production. And these sort of things usually emerge, in contexts such as this, like symposium or an exhibition or publication or residency. But all of this is well and good, but like, how do we actually plug these new findings more intentionally into more durable and infrastructural forms? So since 2018, I've been super lucky to be part of the Serpentine Arts Technologies team, trying to focus specifically on this kind of larger question. And, you know, apart from the relative kind of emotional neutrality to some extent of the arts technology space, what's really useful about it is that it's increasingly a separate domain that has more in common kind of with the polymathic world building or attempts at polymathic world building across the ages that have integrated philosophy, science, and technology than it has to do with the kind of modern and contemporary art domains as domains that strive to center arts autonomy and to kind of claim separation from society, or at least from, let's say, the complex, commercial, economically driven society. So this Leibniz's calculator, I just thought it was kind of cute, which in fact I think should not be attributed exclusively to Leibniz. It relied on the expertise and labor of a truly cross-disciplinary team. You know, is one such historical example of potentially where the contemporary arts technologies domain, what it can kind of continue. Because the actual praxis of building systems and artifacts, whether as artworks or as an infrastructure for collaboration or for artworks, through kind of collaborative work has a lot of unrealized potential for testing out economic and legal frameworks that would be inconceivably difficult to actualize in domains more explicitly oriented towards commercial and or more narrow discipline-bound concerns. So if we think of economics, you know, and this is like a very lay understanding, but maybe accurate, as something that has been abstracted out of the social and the ecosystemic, the relatively low-risk lab of context of art and technology allows us to imagine how reintegration could be possible, not just theoretically, but also operationally. So in this sense, it is useful to think of art and culture part in the question that we're posing today, less as an industry oriented towards the production of objects, which is the kind of standard way of thinking about, I guess, art and culture, and more as a low-risk space where there is no wrong or right way to draw connections between things, and that the process of doing that carries a lot of value in and of itself, particularly around such topics as ownership that appear so alienating because they feel so outside of one's control, and yet seem to have complete control over everything, obviously ourselves included.
All right, so a few ways into the question of ownership. You know, what is ownership and what is it for? I think one important lens is that ownership is a way that states or other powerful actors are able to scale their power beyond a small size. So if you consider like a king in the Middle Ages, they are not able to exercise control over their entire territory by themselves. So what they have to do is essentially, you know, deputize other people who become their sort of lords and barons, and their holdings, their sort of delegations of the king's privilege become like ownership interests. Now. And this is, you know, in many ways kind of the origin of you know, one way of thinking about the origin of property. Formally speaking, you can think of also of ownership, it's often thought of as like a bundle of rights, sort of a bundle of rights delegated by the state to an owner. And in its modern form, it's not lodged in the hands of like the king's loyalists, but is, you know, doesn't run in these sort of hereditary systems, but is instead tradable between people, buyable and sellable. And ownership interests can also take on, you know, importantly, they can take on a life of their own and become very powerful, often too powerful even for the states that sort of underwrite them to effectively control. So what happens when this happens? You know, what happens when ownership interests become you know, sort of overspill their boundaries? There are a few key sort of methods by which societies negotiate extremely powerful ownership interests. I think, you know, one way of breaking this down is by just thinking about the categories of like regulation and taxation and war. These are sort of the things that societies do to deal with ownership interests. But in many ways, they're, in different ways, each of these can be unsatisfactory. One issue is that they often arrive after the damage has been done. And especially in the case of war, they can do damage of their own. They don't really get to the DNA of ownership interests themselves. They're more like things that you do about ownership interests rather than reimaginings of the interests from the inside. And I think most importantly, these methods, regulation, taxation, and war, are not really new strategies for interdependence. They are just kind of reactions against the excesses of unilateral power created by ownership interests. So by imagining new ways of weaving our interests together, I think that's how a space opens up for new kinds of ownership interests with a different shape and potentially issued from different institutions and different authorities. So this is the space of possibilities that we really want to point to today, and that we hope you'll all spend some time exploring. There's a kind of a figure ground shift here when you focus on reconfiguring the underlying structures and reach of ownership interests themselves. Some of the questions that arise are, who can be an owner? What can be owned and on what terms? How can we understand ownership interests as relationships between agents rather than sort of dominion over objects? Should ownership interests be permanent? How should we think about how long they last? Should intellectual property necessarily attach to individuals, or should it in some way attach to the larger networks that are the real sources of ideas and expressions? Now, just to name a difficulty, it's really challenging to, I think, reimagine ownership interests in public because it's so deeply tied up with people's emotions and kind of long-held assumptions. The questions that it raises are not only technical and discursive, but also emotional and imaginative. And I think this is why cultural and artistic work can play such a key role in helping us navigate through the challenge that we face.
So if in theory we can agree that within property-driven societies, the notion of completely static, stable, and predictable ownership interest cuts us off from one another and from the world, what are the steps that we can take to develop the networks of ethical interdependence that we crave? So intuitively, we know that for ownership interests to evolve, they need to become more fluid, more changing, and more open, and that at its core, the resistance to those processes is fear-based. Thus, the imaginative project before us is to help us imagine how greater interdependence can look and feel like, a path to greater security rather than to greater insecurity. So new ownership imaginaries give us new ways of tying our interests to one another, to ecosystems, and to values. But landing these imaginaries in concrete, operationalizable models with the help of invested communities, the law, and technology allows for the bridges to be built as we walk across them. So working title, partial common ownership, would be better partial common stewardship, but we're still working on it, is one such model that we're currently developing, so with RadicalxChange and Aristine Foundation and a growing community of supporters. So that project presents a promising design pattern. And the core imaginary shift that it prompts is to move away from exclusive ownership to stewardship for artworks that carry the energy and missions of a larger community or issue. The model does not solve all property-related issues, no model ever could, but it allows for very specific experiments in dealing with network value creation in a more generative way by weaving together the interest of networks of people and quote-unquote assets, or things that circulate in an economy. So for conceiving of an artwork not as a permanent endowment of any owner, but as a temporary connector between a steward and wider mission. And just to say that we will be going more into this in the afternoon for those who are interested.
So one other quick point I think that is important to raise is the new questions brought up by generative AI. I think that the issues, the ownership-related issues that this technology brings about are really, really important. I think probably no less important than the issues raised by the printing press or radio, music recording, television, or the internet, or any of these other really epochal technologies that change the way we're able to compress information and process information. And I think the issue I want to point to is that if you think about the role that intellectual property has played in helping society deal with these new technologies, it hasn't always just been about distributing value. In a way, it's also played an important role in helping to sort of keep people grounded in a certain notion of reality, as against the potential, deceptive possibilities of technology. So, for example, without the copyright statutes of the 18th century, it's conceivable that the sort of, the way to interpret a byline of a text would have been completely different. You wouldn't have known where exactly the ideas in the written form that you're reading were coming from. Similarly, if you think about trademark, for example, which is another kind of pillar of intellectual property, right? Trademark helps. The idea of trademark is that it helps consumers have a clear idea of who they're doing business with. And the theme here is that if we do not know who is speaking, basically we can't understand what is being said. And if you have millions of people sort of speaking through generative models, or even individual people speaking through generative models without disclosing it, it kind of puts the interpretability of all kinds of information at risk. So there are super important issues in how intellectual property grapples with generative AI. There are important cases making their way through the courts in the United States and important regulatory initiatives in the European Union that are going to have a really important long-term probably consequences for this technology. But I think the key point is that they're not going to resolve the problem. Training models on copyrighted material either is a copyright violation or isn't, and both possibilities are very weird. So I think what we really need is to kind of fundamentally rethink what we want intellectual property law to accomplish, which I think kind of goes to this question of what is the nature of the artist or agent that we want the law to protect. So I hope this is another question that we can start to spend some time on together today.
But obviously, AI and legal categories of ownership protection are not the only kind of elephants in the room that can benefit from an imaginary revision and experimentation. And luckily, in this room, we have ample expertise pertaining to a wide spectrum of domains. So on this note, we hope that we can use today to connect the dots between the various projects that you're in the middle of. And hopefully, the exchanges can enrich the paths and open up new ones.